This War Without an Enemy. This is a two-player war game published by Nuts. It is about the English civil wars of the 17th century. In particular, it covers 1642 to 1646. Two players, as we said. One player will control royalist forces and the other player parliamentarian forces. It is a block war game, so if you know this style of game, you know that limited information is very important. Game pieces representing military forces will be represented by wooden blocks facing the owning player only, so you have limited intelligence about what the opponent has, you know the location of their forces, but not necessarily exactly what they represent. On top of that, it is also a card-driven game, which is, and it is based on secret simultaneous card play. So again, bluffing, trying to outsmart the opponent, trying to figure out what card they're gonna play, it's very, very important. All of these elements make this game not particularly well suited for solitaire play, especially if you play both sides to the best of your possibilities, and this is exactly how I played it. Because these are times of pandemic, times of quarantine, the game is too complex to play with my daughters. I don't have my usual human opponents to play with, and I wanted to play it. So I still played it solitaire, controlling both sides to the best of my possibilities with adjustments that I will describe in the conclusions. It's possibly not the best way to play the game, but it's how I played it. So just I need to give you that full disclosure before we go any further. Now, the game is played on this mounted board here that looks really, really nice. It is large, mounted as I said, nice color, nice graphics, but also still very, very functional. No ambiguities, no problems whatsoever. The map is divided into areas, and the borders may be dotted lines, simply dotted lines. They may represent landscape features. They may be color lines that divide the map by different regions, and that will have an effect on deployment and movements of troops. We have cities. Cities are very important. The outline will tell you whether the city is fortified or not. That shape there means it is fortified. You have a number of victory points that the city is worth. You have a storming value, that's the number of attacking troops that may storm the city during a siege, and we'll talk about that later. But again, very, very important. Some areas are also designated as ports. Doing sea moves past enemy ports is usually not that great of an idea, at least it's a dangerous proposition. So, this is the general map. Cities are very important because victory conditions will change based on the scenario, but generally speaking, you score victory points by controlling cities. Also, capturing and beheading the poor, unhappy king charge is usually a good idea, at least for the parliamentarian player. That definitely helps gain victory. So, the game has different scenarios. It's divided by years, 1642 to 1646. Each year is divided into 6 turns, the 6 being a winter turn and 5 full campaign turns. If you're playing the full scenario, the full campaign, the full war, it starts in late 1642, so you have a shorter year then. Now, we were talking about the cards. There are 2 decks, one deck per player, one for the royalists and one for the parliament. And these cards have a number of action points here on top. They may also have events, and if they do have events, they have a letter here that tells you in which phase of the turn the event will take place. For example, this is a tactical event, will take place during battles or in the phase of the turn when battles are resolved. Operational event, some events may apply to either. Supply events. And then here at the bottom we have indications of when the card is in play. The little teeny tiny microscopic arrow means that the card is removed that here. A teeny tiny arrow at the bottom means that the card is added in a certain year. And so depending on the campaign, the deck on the scenario, but in general, it will happen usually that the deck changes, and so it is altered as the game progresses to mirror historical events that happen at in different moments of the war. The forces, as I mentioned, are represented by wooden blocks that are usually standing upright and facing the owning player. We have a number of strength points, the dots that you see there, and when the block is standing upright, the number you see on top is number of strength points. This one would have 3. If it takes a hit, it is reduced to 2, takes another hit, reduced to 1, receives reinforcements, goes back to 2, and you update the current strength of the unit simply by rotating the block accordingly. The number you see in the top right corner is the effectiveness. So when you roll dice in combat, you will roll a number of dice equal to the number of strength points, and you score a hit for each die that shows a number equal to or lower than the effectiveness. Yes, it's one of those games where you do well when you roll low, which I don't always really understand. It would just be much more fun if instead of a 2 it would be a 5, because it gives me the same range, still 2 hits out of 6, and just like, yes, I rolled a 6. It was like, yeah, I rolled a 1, but that gives me always mixed feelings because it doesn't feel right. The art tells you what kind of troop you have. We have cavalry, infantry, and artillery, and they do work very different from one another. Then we have leaders that also have combat values, but also do other things. Letters that you see there at the bottom indicate regional blocks. They can't just go wherever they want, anytime they want. They have restrictions, and so usually they need to be shopped around outside of their normal local area by leaders. And then cavalry has another number here which indicates the discipline. These cavalry people, they really are passionate, and when cavalry fights against cavalry and you defeat the opponent, your winning cavalry is likely to just go on a spree and start following them. So you will have to roll a die and hope that you roll equal to or lower than the discipline, because rolling low is good in this game, and in which case then your cavalry stays there, otherwise it just leaves the battle because you're so happy that they're running against the opponent. I'm gonna put a bunch of blocks kind of randomly on the board now, just for the fun of it, so that it looks a little cooler. Now, how do we play the game? I'm glad you asked. Otherwise, why would you be watching this video? I don't understand. Don't you have anything better to do? No? Good. So keep watching. Now, how do we play the game? As I said, each year is divided into turns. And at the beginning of each turn, each player will commit a card secretly. Then we reveal the cards and we see who has initiative. The player with the highest number there gets to choose who has initiative. If there is a tie early on in the game, the royalist player breaks the tie, and later in the game, the parliament player breaks the tie. In general, things look good for the royalist player early on in the game, and then the royalist party loses steam, and it's really hard to win if you don't have an early victory, and the parliament really tends to catch up later between reinforcements that they get, their army is restructured, it gets tougher. So we decide who has initiative, and that will determine who goes first. Then players will, there will be an operational phase in which players spend their action points, the number indicated there. And again, there may be events that are resolved during the operational phase. It's a game where you get action points and also action points from a card. A lot of card-driven games are either or, not here. The action points, you can spend an action point to activate a region and move blocks in that region. When blocks enter a region controlled by the enemy, in any case where there are enemy blocks. Then you pin down the blocks that are there, and there will be a battle that is resolved there. It's also possible then when the opponent gets to move that they will reinforce. So both players have an operational phase in which they get to move troops, and then you resolve battles. During the operational phase, you can also do sea moves, but again, as we said, it can be dangerous if you go past a port controlled by an opponent. During these moves, it's also possible that you enter an area where there is a city, and the defenders that were there decide to withdraw in the city, then there will be a siege there. Other things you can do is a muster move, which is you choose a friendly area. So instead of activating an area as the departing area for movement, you choose a friendly area and you can move their blocks that could legally move to that location, which is something I don't see often in war games. I guess one of the few games where I see this kind of move, I remember from Rumble in the Desert, which is a game that I like very much. So, and also you can spend action points to get new blocks on the board and to heal, so to speak, weakened blocks. So a lot of flexibility here, moving, getting new blocks on the board, getting reinforcements, ship them around, hide them in towns. That's for the operational phase, when both players resolve operational events and move troops, possibly start battles. When it is time to resolve battles, we are going to transfer the troops involved in the battle onto this player aid here, which is very important because a battle is somewhat involved. You will place the troops in the corresponding area based on type, artillery, cavalry, infantry, and so on and so forth. There is a side for the defender, a side for the attacker, and then different things will happen in each battle turn, and here you have a sequence. Basically, this combat system wants to emphasize how these different parts of the military forces work differently. So not in turn 1 or turn 2 of a battle, but only in turn 2 and 3, there may be a general retreat. In turn 2 only, reserves enter battle, reserves that have been brought there but were not able to participate in the battle at the first turn because they were added later during the operational phase. Then in turn 1 only, artillery doesn't do much in battles. In turn 1 only, artillery gets to fire. And then you have pretty much moving in this direction here. After artillery fires, you have firing infantry. When you have infantry in a battle, you can choose to place it in the firing area or in the engaging area. In the firing area, they get to fire earlier, to attack earlier in a turn, but at a penalty of -1 on their effectiveness. Then you have cavalry, which has its own rules based on whether or not the opponent has cavalry. If you smash the cavalry of the opponent, these guys really want to go and you have to discipline them. And then you have the engaging infantry that patiently waited until everybody else went, and then they can attack, and they do it without that penalty. Again, the general idea is that you roll a number of dice equal to the strength of the attacking block, each number equal or lower than the effectiveness is a hit. You cannot target specific blocks, but your hits will be applied to the strongest block within the group that you targeted. So, and again, different units will get to target different things. Cavalry loves cavalry, infantry, artillery, for example, can attack cavalry or infantry, things like that. Back and forth, weaken blocks, go through the entire procedure, and so that's how that part works. One last thing we need to talk about is sieges. That is almost like a mini game in its own, because all the things that may happen when you have defending forces inside a city and a sufficient number of other forces outside. What happens is that the defending player may bring in reinforcements, so there may be a battle outside of the city, in which case the attacker, the besieging player, has to choose whether to temporarily suspend the siege, to fight better, in the battlefield at a penalty on your effectiveness in the siege, or to fight while you maintain the siege. The besieged player can choose to sally, so you get out of the walls and you attack the besieging player. The besieging player can choose to storm the city, in which case first you roll on the bombardment table. You better have artillery, because you have to see if you're able, by cross-referencing the die roll with your artillery strength, if you're able to breach the walls or not. After you check if you breach before storming, then you resolve storming, which is a battle with specific rules and penalties, especially for the attacker, that only has a limited number of blocks that they can use, equal or lower than the storming value of the city. If you didn't breach, it takes 2 hits to inflict 1 point of damage on the attacker. And then at the end of the turn, you're in the supply phase. If for all places are still besieged, then you check to see if there is attrition or possibly surrender on the attrition and surrender table. That's a name that tells you quite accurately what happens there. So as you can see, there's quite a lot going on. Operational phase, find, move around, do these other acts, and then the tactical phase that involves battles and other combat around sieges. Then you have a supply phase, and you continue like this until a scenario is over, and then you determine who the winner is. This is a solid game, as you saw, with a very nice production. The one thing when it comes to the production that was a little below the standard of the rest of the game is the rule book, which gets the job done, but somehow the information is scattered in different locations. It's not always easy to retrieve. You get the sense, oh, I remember about that rule, and it's not what you think it is. It took me a while, for example, after I read the rule book the first time, to figure out how many cards you get each turn, because it's at the very beginning of the rule book where Lucas is just introducing main concepts, but that's a key element of the rules. So the rule book could have been done better. Other than that, material production, absolutely very nice and very functional. As for gameplay, this is not a game for the pandemic, because it is a game where you're gonna need an adult human opponent, and a lot of us cannot do that these days, unless your spouse, your partner, your significant other who lives with you is also a war gamer. That may be the case, but I don't know that that's very common. So as for me, I'm quarantining, so my wife is not interested in wargaming. My 8-year-old daughter, also known as the littlest general, likes wargames, but this one is simply too complicated for her now. In the future, she'll be okay. Block war games in general we tend to associate with fairly lean rule sets, just because Columbia Games is the one that produced probably most of the block war games out there. They're famous for that, and they tend to have short rule books. Worthington Games also continued that tradition. Of course, there's no reason why you can't have a 200-page manual and a game that has blocks. But there is that expectation. Well, this is not a game of that kind. Definitely, it is much more complex than most block war games out there. It's all worth it. It doesn't look like the complexity was added for the sake of it. It really gives you historical detail. It really gives you flavor, nuance, at all levels, from the operational level to the strategic level. From year after year, you know that certain things will happen, that the armies will change, but that means that you have more rules to take care of that. The operational level, when it comes to moving, when it comes to who can go where, at what time, who has to return to what locations, how do you maneuver armies in and out of cities, etc., etc., etc. And then at the tactical level, which, by the way, is to me where one of the reasons, one of the areas where the game shines, because it's really fascinating. On one hand, you have this almost epic sweep, because you have the entire event, and you have the change of strategic initiative from the royalists to the parliament. You have groups that come and go. You have the armies that are reorganized. You really have the sense of a large event. But then when battles are resolved, you zoom in at this incredible level of detail in which it's not just about a numerical adjustment like you have in so many other games, including block war games. You really have the sense that artillery works in certain ways, and infantry, you have that choice where you're going to place them. Are they going to fire now? Are they going to engage? And the fact that each group can engage, or in any case can interact with certain groups in certain times, at certain times during the battle, and they may or may not disappear, etc., etc., etc. The cavalry, it's its own thing, its own drama queen in a sense. It's all about them. All of these things are stunning, no less than that, but each comes with its own subset of rules. So it is just a lot more complex than most other block war games, and again, it also makes it harder to play by yourself. Not because of the complexity, but because it's a game that really, in my opinion, shines when you play it against another human opponent. But that's an untested hypothesis because I played the game by myself. So I lost the secret hidden information that you have when you play a block war game against another opponent, that is, you only see the back of their blocks. So I see how this means that there could be a lot of opportunities for traps and ambushes, etc., etc., etc. But at the same time, so I could still play it. I lost that element, but I didn't think that I lost everything I loved. The one thing I could not, I had to address was card play, because it reminded me in the sense of Julius Caesar, in which you also select a card per turn and you reveal them, and there's a lot of like of guessing what the opponent may place there, trying to annul their card, trying to interfere with their card, and this simply I could not do. So the way I did it, simply, and maybe a little radical, is each turn I drew a random card from the deck. I organized the deck based on what the deck was supposed to be for that year, and I just drew a card for the king and a card from the parliament, and I went for it, and I found myself doing stupid things. But you know what? Sometimes I do stupid things against human opponents, so at least this time I didn't have to feel bad. Hey, that's the only card I got. That's what I have to get. So that added randomness because I had no control over the events. I had no control over how many action points each side got each turn. I just had to go with the flow. And in that sense, the game worked. The game was still entertaining, but you had this caveat. This review is based on my own version of playing the game that at least was still very enjoyable. I still enjoyed the game. I don't think I got everything that the game has to offer. I think that game of cat and mouse, of mind reading element will make the game even more interesting. But I don't know when the pandemic and when the quarantine are gonna end, so I didn't want to wait that long to try the game. So I tried it this way. Maybe one day after the pandemic, I'll make an updated video about what it feels like playing it against a human opponent. But is not a game that everybody can play solitaire. You have to make that adjustment, and you have to have the taste for it, the taste for see what happens, deal with the constant chaos, deal with the madness of having to do with very restrictive, very chaotic, very random situation. I personally enjoyed it, and although it's an hypothesis, I think this is a game that is going to be a lot more fun and even more solid when I can play it against a human opponent. It's sad that it came out now, not a year ago, then I would have been able to play it the way it's supposed to. But this War Without an Enemy, it's an impressive game. Yes, it has more complexity than most other block war games out there, but it's all worth it because you have a lot of interesting decisions that come out from the different ways that the units interact in different parts of the map at different times, etc., etc., etc. But most importantly, really adds a ton of chrome. It really is almost a dissertation, almost like an essay about this event in playable format. That means extra rules, but then each element of the confrontation really works the way it should, really comes with a lot of historical flavor, and that of course is an advantage. Not the best game to play solitaire, but that's the only way I could play it, and that's the way I played it, and these are my, again, somewhat provisional opinions about this War Without an Enemy. It's a strong game, I think it can be even stronger, but I'll tell you about that after the pandemic.